Good afternoon. My name is Marian Krumkowski, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Leland County. Welcome to our forum. The League of Women Voters is a national organization, political organization, that encourages the informed and active participation in government by all citizens. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and to hope to influence public policy through forums like this and then advocacy. The League is a nonpartisan organization, and as an organization, we do not support or endorse candidates or political parties. The League has state and local chapters. Men and women who are 16 years of age or older are welcome to join. In our league here, we have about 30% or so male members, so we definitely are an organization that is open to men and women. Dues are $60 a year for an individual or $90 for members who live in the same household. Membership applications can be found on the handouts on your table on the back side of the agenda, and also we have brochures outside. Additional information can always be found at our website, LWVLC.org, and we have a Facebook page also. Before we go much further here today, are there any candidates here? And if so, if you'd like to stand and introduce yourself and say what office you're running for. Okay.
Please.
Well, I think you should go first.
No,
Dana Sam Getzinger, and I'm running for County Commissioner in District 2.
Good afternoon, Joe Hubbell. I'm your candidate for the prosecutor's office for Leland County. Thank you for inviting me.
Patricia Sotis Little, running for re-election for District 5, County Commissioner, Leland and Centerville.
Ty Wessel, running for re-election, County Commission, District 4.
Are there any township or school board candidates here? Okay, thank you. We do have voter guides. The League of Women Voters Michigan publishes a voter guide that has information on national and state races, on many of the nonpartisan races, which are the judges, and the regions are partisan. But a lot of information on candidates that may not have come here locally to see their backgrounds, and also some local races. Voter guides are at the table out at the entranceway here, and obviously a week from yesterday, November 8th. So if you plan on voting in person, make sure you put that on your calendar and get there. Absentee ballot applications are available here. You need to get those into the township clerk and to get that done before the end of that time limit. Thank you. Today we host a forum entitled Early Childhood Intervention, Resiliency, and Good Health. This forum has been organized by the League's Early Childhood Needs and Services Committee. And here is Sue Miller, the chair of that committee, to begin today's event. Sue?
Good afternoon. This past spring, the League started a discussion about how events in early childhood can lead to unanticipated outcomes. We continue that conversation today with a closer look at the connection between adverse childhood experiences and lifelong health consequences. The topic has implications for how we support young children, both individually and through our public policies. And I thought this might be a good time to do a little advocacy for a fundraiser being held tomorrow night at the Congregational Church in Suttons Bay. And it's going to be a piano concert by Tristan Eckerson. And part of the proceeds from this fundraiser are going to go towards the Parenting Communities organization here in the county. And that definitely is all about supporting young children and their families. So if you'd like more information about tickets, you're welcome to see me after the discussion today. Speaking to our topic today is Dr. Mary Beth Hardwick, who's a specialist in internal medicine from Interlochen. She's had a lifelong connection to northern Michigan, having spent her summers and vacations in this area with her family. Prior to her retirement, Dr. Hardwick worked in medical education, teaching medical students and directing an internal medicine residency training program. She went on to form her own small business and worked with 3 colleagues in an internal medicine practice in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. During her career, Dr. Hardwick was the recipient of numerous awards, including multiple nominations as the top doc in the Detroit Hour magazine, the Outstanding Clinical Faculty Award from Wayne State University, and being named one of the best primary care physicians in the country by Town and Country magazine. To keep busy during retirement, Dr. Hardwick volunteers at Traverse City Health Clinic, writes a blog for Grand Traverse Commission on Aging, gives medical lectures for the Senior Center Network in Traverse City, serves on the board at the Leelanau School, and is co-chairing a capital campaign to build a new public library in Interlaken. I'm delighted that she agreed to join us today and share her thoughts on early childhood prevention, resiliency, and good health. Her speech will be followed by a question and answer session that's open to the audience.
Thank you, Sue. I am going to see if I can do this talk without the mic. Can everyone hear me okay? And if you can't, will you let me know? It is very difficult for me to hold a mic still. So we're going to do this without the microphone. And I'm going to start, thank you first of all. Thank you to the League of Women Voters of Leelanau County for asking me here and asking me to talk about a topic that is unbelievably relevant to today. The interesting thing is that I'm an internist, I take care of adults. And I'm here talking to you about a topic that affects children. And you'll see why as we go along. But before I start talking, we are going to show you a TED Talk given by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. Dr. Burke is a pediatrician. She is a founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness, which is in California. Dr. Burke received a medical degree from UC Davis. She went on to get her master's in public health from Harvard, and she completed her pediatric residency at Stanford. So she is very capable of talking about what you're going to hear today. We're going to watch her TED Talk, and then I will follow that with 20 or 25 minutes of my own input, and then we'll open to questions. So, Dr. Nadine Burke.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay. What kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them. Either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed. someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Bloch, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACE study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask, how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness? I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across the lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. If that isn't eye-opening, you weren't listening. What I'm going to do is review some of the things Dr. Burke spoke about, expand a little bit on some of her comments, address what we can do to treat this when we see these adults with all of these medical issues, and then talk about how we can try to prevent this from becoming a worse public health problem than it already is. And I brought copies, maybe they've been passed out, but I brought copies of the survey that was used in the original ACE study. And this is the survey that is used by pediatricians when they are surveying for adverse childhood experiences. And a couple comments. ACEs are not directly linked to disease. So in other words, if I have a patient in my office with depression, I can't say, oh, you obviously had 4 or more ACEs. But if I have a patient in my office with 4 ACEs, I can say you are at much higher risk for depression, and you are at a 12-fold risk for suicide. So knowing about ACEs as an internist is almost as important as knowing about ACEs as a pediatrician. The other thing to tell you and to make very understandable is ACEs are in fact a dose-dependent entity. The more ACEs you experience, the higher your ACE score, truly the more likely you are to have adverse health outcomes when you're an adult. And it is true in the studies that have been done and have now been replicated. Children who have ACE scores of 7 or 8 or 9 sometimes have a 20-year decrease in their life expectancy. So ACEs are very real and they are dose dependent. The more a child has in their life, the more likely they are to have really poor health outcomes. What are those health outcomes? Dr. Burke spoke about them. Heart disease, 2.5 to 3-fold risk. Lung disease, 2.5 to 3-fold risk. Chronic hepatitis, 2 to 3-fold risk. Depression, 4 to 5-fold risk. And that 12-fold risk for suicide if you have 4 or more ACEs. That's huge. That is huge. In addition, you have risks for these horribly unhealthy behaviors: smoking, drinking to excess, drug dependence, bad sexual behaviors. Some of these children as adults have 50 or more sexual partners in their lifetimes. You can imagine the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases and AIDS. And I think what I want you to know, and what I found probably just as disturbing as these health outcomes in the patients I take care of, is these children are much more likely to develop both learning and or behavioral problems in school. And if a child has 4 or more ACEs, an ACE score of 4 or more, they are 33 times more likely to have a learning problem or a behavioral problem or both in school. They are far more likely to never succeed in school. And they are far more likely to be misdiagnosed as ADHD. It was fascinating. When I first watched this TED Talk a month or so ago, it's funny to watch because doctors do tend to think